Discuss the situation in Hong Kong now with foreign policy program researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs, Cobus van Staden, joining us via Skype this evening. Cobus, very good evening to you and thanks for your time. Before we actually get to the issue that led to these protests, can you just give us a little bit of history, educate us a little bit, please, about the relationship when it comes to China and Hong Kong, and a little bit of history there as to what goes on between the two?
Well, Hong Kong used to be a British colony, and it was handed back formally to China in 1997. Since then, the two have been living uneasily together because Hong Kong is very cosmopolitan. It has a very strong culture of public speech, of free speech, very liberal society. It's also a major investor in China and a major gateway for financing into China and financing out of China to the rest of the world. So China has a lot riding on Hong Kong being successful, but at the moment they're living under a system called One Country, Two Systems, which is essentially this deal that was struck during the handover that Hong Kong will only revert to living under Chinese rule, under full Chinese system, midway through the century. So at the moment, Hong Kong still has a much more liberal set of laws, a very different set of public institutions compared to the People's Republic of China, although officially they're actually one country.
So the actual issue here, and it's about an extradition bill, and those who are protesting are against this extradition bill. It would amount to criminals being taken to mainland China for prosecution. What was the issue here? What's the problem with that?
Well, you know, it amounts to a kind of a stripping of Hong Kong's legal power, or the legal power to organize its own affairs. So it would represent a big weakening of essentially the one country, two systems model, where Hong Kong, the idea was that Hong Kong would be allowed to essentially run itself within a larger Chinese context. So that would essentially take a lot of that control and move it to Beijing, with you know, the additional impact of simply being able to kind of ship people to Hong Kong, to Beijing if needed. You have to keep in mind that in a lot of cases nowadays, Hong Kong is frequently acted as a kind of a safe haven for people who are seen by the Chinese government as being dissidents or being politically problematic in some kind of way. So it would represent a kind of a significant shift in Hong Kong's own autonomy. So you know, that's the root of the big fight, and with it comes a much more fundamental split between what Hong Kongers want in terms of political rights and what China is willing to give them.
So would you say that these protests then were warranted? I mean, and I would imagine that a lot of this goes to China's human rights history as well.
Yes, I mean it has a lot to do with generally how China tends to deal with dissent. So you know, China is, you know, I think would even represent itself as a form of central authority, right? Hong Kong sees itself as a much more democratic space. So, you know, I think from their perspective, from the Hong Kong perspective, they're fighting around a fundamental issue, a fundamental set of rights that they hold central. From a Beijing perspective, it risks the breaking up of China. And, you know, with it, it risks kind of chaos overflowing from Hong Kong into the mainland, which is something that they're very worried about.
So you have to ask then at this point, you know, what was Hong Kong leader Carrie Lam actually thinking? Why would they come up with such a bill? Whose side is she on?
Well, this is a big question, and this is, you know, she's really been pushed to clarify that by these protests, and the government of Hong Kong has been very, I think, weak in the way that they dealt with this. They, you know, they're kind of flip-flopping. They have very contradictory measures. For example, in some cases, they really crack down very violently on very innocuous, like peaceful protests. This included things like police firing tear gas into closed spaces, like subway stations, which is extremely dangerous. You know, it could cause death. The other there's been cases of what seem to have been hired thugs, like maybe mafia members, randomly attacking commuters on a weekday morning, and the government not doing anything about that, for example. So so the government is really I think in chaos, and they're coming off very badly.
So we understand things are a little calmer. It's not quite over, but a little calmer now with the airport being reopened for a little bit. But how do you see this panning out? How do you see this all ending then? What's the solution here?
It's a very difficult situation. One of the strengths of the protest movement has been that it's essentially leaderless. So it operates. It's not a situation like in earlier pro-democracy uprisings where leaders simply get arrested and that's the end of the protest. So that makes it much more efficient to organize, but it makes it much harder to negotiate because who do you negotiate with? On the other hand, on the Beijing side, they are under a lot of pressure within Beijing to not seem weak in relation to the protest. The Chinese government has started to use words like terrorism. So they're starting sending up kind of trial balloons, hinting at a possible more violent crackdown. That, I think, would be a very serious step, and it's one that I think China itself is very wary of, because China is essentially still suffering decades later from the fallout of the Tiananmen Square crackdown. Yeah. So no one wants that, on their records, but at the same time, I think at the moment they're kind of in a stalemate, and some kind of negotiation would be great, but that itself would be quite difficult to achieve.
Yeah, especially in the current climate there. Thank you very much, Cobus van Staden, just for that explanation and insight.